So let's segue to Anne, because you're the sort of opposite of the older audience. The Sesame Street has traditionally worked with younger kids, preschool, younger even. You have like the littles. You have an interesting phrase for them.
Yeah. Well, there's 0 to 5 infants and toddlers. I work for the Joan Gantz Cooney Center. We're named after the founder of Sesame Street. And she had the radical notion in 1966 that TV could be used to educate children because of its reach as a mass medium. And her challenge was to figure out, I think very similar to ours today with video games and other types of digital media, is how do you incorporate learning goals that are research-based and proven necessary skills for children into video games, social networks, etc.
Can you, when you say research-based, what does that mean?
Well, the Sesame Street model is, I'm not sure if you all are familiar, is pairing childhood development experts with curriculum experts, sort of those buckets that psychologists as well as educators feel need to be filled for children at different stages of their development. So for the age that we're looking at, which is primary school kids, 6 to 12, we're looking at reading, writing skills, oral literacy, a lot of things that are commonly tied to metrics that are used in No Child Left Behind, unfortunately. So we're looking at trying to fill those buckets. So it's kind of more simple in a way because those are tried and true skills that are society, policymakers, most people deem as are absolutely necessary for a child to succeed educationally as well as in life. And I think what's happening now is that there's a new crop of skills that Henry Jenkins has outlined in one of his MacArthur papers that are also necessary for succeeding in life. And I think those skills are ones that games are particularly well suited to develop, such as cooperation, participation, and just basic communication through digital media such as games and other types of media. So our center is interested in kind of looking into video games and other types of digital media content as well as platforms and learning more about how they can be used to teach children in informal environments as well as schools. We're interested in influencing policymakers. We believe that most of the policy, or almost all of the policy out there in state legislators and in Washington are all anti-game and anti-media. We take more of a balanced approach. I would even say among our staff we're mainly pro-media. We just need the proof. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar, but there is an act in Congress right now sponsored by Senator Joe Lieberman called the Camera Act. It's the Children and Research Media Advancement Act. And if it passes, it will allocate money to the National Institute of Child Health and Development to look more into the effects of new media such as games and their emotional, social, and physical effects on children. But there really isn't anything built in the bill that mandates money for learning more about how children interact with games in an educational sense.
In terms of, like you're saying, like these facts, does it have to be Western proof? Because if you look at Japan, they're doing a good amount of studies with games in the classroom. There's at least 2 or 3 floating around, boosting math test scores and stuff like that with brainage. Have you guys looked into markets outside the United States for some of the data that you might be able to present to policy?
I think I'd have to take a closer look. In terms of the literature that's out there, the jury's still out, at least for adults, on whether games in and of themselves actually have the capacity to teach. I'm sure most people, or all the people on this panel, have experiences that say otherwise. But in terms of the literature, it's a pretty mixed bag, actually. And I'm not sure if you guys can speak to that. I think in terms of proof, like, we're looking at trying to figure out, if there are studies that can be done about sort of the interaction and sort of the cognitive skills that are developed in children while they're playing games or using other types of media. And I haven't seen anything like that so far. There's a lot of things that are in the pipeline now, thanks to the MacArthur Foundation, who, sponsoring Katie's amazing school that's in the pipeline as well. And so hopefully, there's going to be a lot of momentum where we will actually have a lot more research about whether or not games work.
I just want to follow up on that a second and then kind of throw it back to you. What has become very clear, and I love this phrase that you just used, in and of themselves, that originally people had this idea that games in and of themselves could teach things. It's sort of like put technology in the classroom and kids will learn technology. Give a kid a game about Africa and they'll learn about Africa. And what, of course, we're beginning to understand is that the game in and of itself can't teach, well, it can teach certain things around games and play, but that it requires the situating of that game within a larger learning environment. And it's the relationship of that game to a whole set of things occurring in and around that game that actually constitute the environment that is structuring how a kid is learning and what they're learning. And so I want to go back to Wade's question about this issue of, if we argue that games teach something, how do we get around the fact that games may teach things that we find to be not so positive for us, right? So if we say, because there's a lot of arguments that we say, okay, games can teach kids how to spell, and they learn how to be good citizens, and they can learn how to think like a sniper, but they're also learning how to shoot a gun, and they're learning how to be mean to other people, and they're learning how to be competitive, and maybe they're learning how to behave badly. And it's sometimes very difficult to talk to audiences that are having a hard time thinking more complexly about that question. So I wanted to try to frame that question in the context of not just what the game is capable of teaching, but when we think about the game as part of a larger system, how does asking that question maybe change the answer that we might give? Yeah.
I got this image in my head now of a whole generation of mean, competitive snipers behaving badly. Not good. So I find it useful to make the following analogy, which is, it's imperfect, but it's useful. Okay, so books, different medium entirely. Is a book good? Is a book bad? And remember, I used the phrase common carrier before, and we're so used to books now that we understand that the question of, oh, if I read a book, am I going to be a better person? Is kind of a meaningless question, because the book is the medium. And there are all these interesting sorts of levels. For example, it may not be inherently useful for kids to learn a fantasy about wizards in a British boarding school, but a whole generation of kids now has much higher reading skills, which they can apply to all kinds of things. So that's kind of a meta level benefit. And similar, but at other levels, for example, I think it was Barbara Tuchman wrote A Distant Mirror about the 14th century, and it was so much fun to read, and all these people actually now know all this historical stuff because they happened to find that book. Steven Pinker is such a good writer that all of these people actually now know all of this work about an entire field of evolutionary linguists, and similarly Carl Sagan did something in a different field. And then you could say, well, but there's Mein Kampf, and then there's violent pornography, and there's all the, but do you start saying books are bad? Well, you know that books are the medium, they're not the content, and as any medium matures, and film is the same way, you're going to find that people are really, really good technically at conveying something to you, and they have all kinds of different messages, and we can't just lump games together as though they have an inherent message. They're a very powerful way of conveying really whatever the author who's good wants to convey. And this discussion should stay at that reality level instead of veering off into weird politics of hype.